The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. Supermax prisons across the United States hold a hidden world the public rarely sees. Buried deep inside their walls is a place officials unofficially call the no-return unit, a pod reserved for the most violent, unpredictable, and unmanageable inmates. These are individuals who stabbed rivals on the yard, ambushed officers, led gang wars, or attempted high-risk escapes. Inside this unit, the rules of normal prison life stop. Movement is restricted to inches. Time slows. Silence dominates. Days blend into weeks, and weeks blur into years. This documentary breaks down what existence looks like inside these high-security pods. Places like ADX Florence's control unit and the SHU at Pelican Bay, where inmates spend up to 24 hours a day alone, surrounded by steel, concrete, and their own thoughts. What happens inside these walls is rarely as simple as punishment. It's a system built to contain danger, but often produces something far more complicated: psychological erosion, deep paranoia, and inmates who rarely return to normal population, alive or mentally intact. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The architecture of control. Supermax facilities are engineered for one purpose: total control. The no-return unit represents the highest tier of that system. Everything about the physical structure is designed to limit movement, prevent communication, and eliminate risk. Cells are built from reinforced concrete, typically measuring 7 by 12 feet. A narrow slit window, if any, provides minimal natural light. The bed is a concrete platform. The desk is welded to the wall. The toilet is made from stainless steel and bolted down. Nothing inside the cell can be used as a weapon or as leverage in an escape attempt. The most defining feature of these units is the door. Instead of standard bars, inmates face a thick steel door with only 2 openings: a small window covered with reinforced glass and a food slot used for meal delivery, handcuffing, and passing property. This slot becomes the inmate's only point of contact with the outside world. It's the place where officers secure wrist restraints, where medical staff slide documents, and where inmates occasionally attempt to shout down the tier for a few seconds before being silenced by disciplinary threats. The hallways are long, quiet, and built with acoustic dampening materials to prevent sound from carrying. This eliminates inmate communication, which is essential in controlling gang leaders who have orchestrated assaults and hits from inside regular units. Cameras line every corner. Microphones are embedded in the ceiling. Some facilities use motion sensors and pressure-sensitive flooring near high-risk cells. Officers inside these pods operate differently from general population guards. They work in pairs or teams, always equipped with pepper spray, shields, and restraints. Every movement, showers, medical checks, attorney visits, requires a choreographed procedure. Showers are enclosed units with locked doors and no exposed fixtures. There is no direct contact with staff. Meals arrive on plastic trays slid through the slot, often cold because they sit in transport carts while officers move door to door. Recreation, when given, takes place in small, caged areas, sunless concrete boxes roughly the size of a parking space. In some facilities, inmates experience recreation cages indoors, meaning they exercise under fluorescent lights without ever stepping outside. The design of the unit intentionally minimizes stimulation. No clocks, no communal spaces, no colors. Cells are gray. Hallways are gray. Lights remain on nearly 24 hours a day, though dimmed during night hours. This environment removes any sense of time, direction, or normality. Architects claim the design reduces violence and prevents inmates from studying staff routines. Critics argue it destroys the human mind piece by piece. Transport inside the unit involves strict procedure. Before exiting the cell, Inmates must cuff their hands through the slot. After that, officers open the door and apply additional restraints. Waist chains, leg irons, tether straps. Movement is slow, controlled, and monitored by multiple officers. The inmate never walks freely. He shuffles, hands bound, tattoos across his knuckles, or forearms visible as he steadies himself. These pods are intentionally isolated from the rest of the prison. They operate like a prison within a prison, with their own schedules, specialized teams, and protocols. Officers working in these units undergo additional training in crisis response, mental health emergencies, and riot control tactics. They are trained to anticipate manipulation, hidden weapons, and sudden violence. Every shift brings potential danger. These inmates are often those who have stabbed rivals with handmade shanks, attacked staff, or attempted escapes using complex, improvised tools. The no-return unit earns its name for more than just the level of security. Few inmates transfer out. Many spend years, even decades, locked in these cells. Some die inside. Some lose touch with reality. Others adapt, becoming silent, calculating, and withdrawn as the environment reshapes them. The architecture doesn't just hold bodies. It shapes minds, pushes limits, and tests what happens when control becomes absolute. Daily routine in extreme isolation. Life inside the no-return unit follows the same rigid pattern every single day. There are no variations, no surprises, and no real sense of time passing. Inmates in these pods wake, eat, shower, exercise, and sleep under a schedule so repetitive that many lose track of what day it is. The system is engineered around predictability because predictability reduces risk. But for the men locked inside these small concrete boxes, it also strips away the basic markers of life. Most days begin long before an inmate is awake. Lights never fully shut off in these cells. They dim at night, but a soft white or pale blue glow stays on to give staff visibility during rounds. By the time an inmate opens his eyes, the morning count is already underway. Officers walk the tier at set intervals, peering through the narrow door windows to confirm each inmate is alive, breathing, and accounted for. This can happen multiple times a night and continues throughout the day. Some inmates sleep through it. Others lie awake and wait for the pattern to reset. Breakfast arrives early. Officers will cart down the tier and slide trays through the food slot. The meal is usually cold by the time it reaches the cell. Oatmeal, a piece of fruit, a carton of milk, or sometimes processed eggs. Inmates are cuffed only if the door is opened. Otherwise, trays pass through the slot with no physical interaction. Most inmates eat in silence and finish quickly, partly because the environment offers nothing else to focus on. The tray is then pushed back through the slot for collection. Some inmates keep leftovers hidden for later, but officers routinely search for hoarded food because it can be used to attract pests or ferment into makeshift alcohol. After breakfast, the day settles into hours of stillness. There's no job assignment, no yard call, no school program, no movement to a dining hall. Inmates remain in the same concrete room unless they are scheduled for a shower or a brief recreation period. Much of the day is spent on the bed or pacing back and forth, 7 or 8 steps each way, repeated nonstop. Some inmates develop set routines for mental survival, reading the same books repeatedly, doing hundreds of push-ups, or counting the bricks in the walls. Others lie motionless, staring at the ceiling. Some talk to themselves for stimulation or mutter conversations with people who aren't there. Showers take place a few times a week, depending on the facility. Before leaving the cell, an inmate must back up to the door, place his hands through the slot, and allow staff to cuff him. Once restrained, the door opens, and a team of officers escorts him to the shower stall, a small, enclosed space with no loose fixtures. The water turns on automatically, controlled from outside. The inmate has roughly 10 minutes. After that, the water cuts off whether he's rinsed or not. Officers uncuff him only after he is secured inside the shower cage. Once time is up, the same escort process leads him back to the cell. The interaction is procedural, wordless, and efficient. Recreation is another tightly controlled part of the routine. Some facilities allow 1 hour a day, others offer fewer sessions. Recreation can mean stepping into an outdoor cage surrounded by high concrete walls and metal fencing overhead. In some Supermax prisons, outdoor rec isn't truly outdoors. It's an indoor pen with no natural sunlight. An inmate stands or paces in a box of concrete and steel. He may do push-ups or jog in tight circles. No equipment is provided, and no other inmates are present. Officers watch from a distance or through tinted glass. For many, this hour is the only change of scenery they get all week. When inmates return from rec, another long stretch of isolation begins. Lunch trays are delivered midday, followed by more silence. Officers conduct rounds, sometimes hourly, sometimes randomly. These checks prevent self-harm, track behavioral changes, and ensure compliance. Because the inmates in these units are among the most dangerous in the prison system, staff remain alert to sudden aggression. An inmate might rush the door, throw liquid, or attempt to jam the food slot. But more often, the environment drains inmates of the energy to fight. The monotony becomes the strongest form of restraint. Mental health visits are rare and brief. Staff may speak through the door or through a grate in the wall. Sessions involve basic questions about sleep, appetite, or thoughts of self-harm. Psychologists are familiar with the effects of prolonged isolation, anxiety, hallucinations, depression, but institutional constraints limit what support they can offer. If an inmate's condition worsens, he may be transferred to a mental health unit, but many deteriorate quietly and unnoticed. Books, letters, and legal mail become a lifeline. Inmates read anything they can get: old magazines, dog-eared paperbacks, religious texts. Some write long letters to family or attorneys, hoping for connection. But communication is slow, heavily monitored, and often delayed by security checks. Some inmates have no mail at all. Their families have vanished or given up after years of limited contact. Dinner arrives in the early evening, similar in quality to breakfast and lunch. Once trays are removed, the final hours of the day stretch out. Lights remain dim, but never fully off. Noise levels remain low. No shouting, no conversations, no social interaction beyond the occasional echo from another cell. Sleep becomes inconsistent. Some inmates sleep in short bursts. Others lie awake until morning count restarts. The constant illumination and lack of natural cues throw the body into confusion. Days and nights blend, leaving inmates unable to track time without carving marks into the wall or creating mental calendars. Over months and years, the routine becomes a psychological force of its own. Some inmates adapt by building rigid internal schedules. Others fall apart, developing paranoia or losing grip on reality. A few find ways to weaponize isolation, using the hours to strategize, plan, or harden themselves mentally. But for most, the day looks the same: stillness, silence, routine. A life measured by trays, cuffs, and the sound of boots moving down the tier. The psychological breakdown. The no-return unit doesn't just confine the body. It reshapes the mind. Prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and the constant presence of steel and concrete create a psychological environment unlike any other in the prison system. Inmates who arrive in these units often come in aggressive, unpredictable, and combative. After months or years inside, their behavior shifts, sometimes in controlled, stable ways, but often through a slow and damaging decline. Mental breakdown is not a rare occurrence here. It's a predictable outcome. It starts with time distortion. Without clocks, sunlight, or consistent external cues, inmates lose their sense of day and night. They may sleep when they should be awake, or stay awake for days. Some describe the experience as floating through time without direction. Others say the days blend so heavily that they stop trying to keep track. This disorientation becomes the foundation for deeper psychological changes. Isolation removes social feedback, something the human brain naturally relies on. In most prison units, inmates shout between cells, interact during meals, participate in programs, or move around the yard. In the no-return unit, None of that exists. Silence instead becomes a constant presence. Days pass with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional shuffle of officers, and the faint metallic thud of a door closing somewhere down the tier. For men who entered the system already struggling with mental health, the environment accelerates decline. Those without pre-existing conditions often begin showing symptoms after extended confinement. Anxiety becomes common, followed by irritability, paranoia, and difficulty thinking clearly. The mind begins reaching for stimulation that simply isn't there. Some inmates fixate on small details, counting bolts on the door, memorizing cracks in the concrete, rereading the same sentence in a book until it loses meaning. It's not boredom. It's the brain trying to anchor itself to anything solid. Hallucinations are also common. Inmates report hearing voices in the vents, thinking someone is watching them through invisible cameras, or believing they're being poisoned through meal trays. Some feel their cell shrinking or expanding. Others hear footsteps that aren't real. These hallucinations often stem from sensory starvation, where the mind generates stimulation to fill the void. Staff are trained to recognize these signs, but resources are limited, and mental health referrals often require severe deterioration before intervention occurs. Violent behavior may decrease in isolation, but internal aggression rises. Some inmates direct it inward. Self-harm becomes a major concern in these units. Officers regularly conduct wellness checks because inmates have been known to cut themselves with improvised tools, bang their heads against the wall, or attempt suicide using bedsheets or clothing. When an inmate shows signs of extreme distress, staff may place him on suicide watch, removing his property and placing him in a specialized observation cell. But the underlying environment remains unchanged. Others respond to isolation with outward defiance. They shout, curse, and bang on the door for hours. They flood their cells by blocking the toilet. They throw liquids at staff. These rage cycles often stem from the need for stimulation. Staff may respond with disciplinary measures, loss of showers, loss of rec, or placement in more restrictive subunits. The result is a deeper spiral. Communication becomes impaired. Some inmates stop speaking entirely, saving their words for moments when they have something important to say. Others talk nonstop, narrating their thoughts or speaking to people who aren't there. This isn't always madness. Sometimes it's a coping mechanism to preserve some sense of dialogue. Speaking into the void helps some inmates feel less alone. The lack of physical touch is another factor that influences decline. Months or years can pass without an inmate making contact with another human being. Even during escort procedures, officers maintain distance, using chains and control positions to avoid direct touch. The absence of contact creates emotional numbness. Inmates begin feeling disconnected not only from others but from themselves. Reading and writing provide limited escape, but attention spans shorten over time. Some inmates struggle to focus long enough to finish a page. Others become obsessive readers, but retain little of what they read. Letters from family help temporarily, but long-term inmates often experience deteriorating family relationships. Children grow up, partners leave, friends disappear. The sense of isolation deepens as outside connections fade. The most complex psychological impact is what inmates call cell madness, a term used across multiple Supermax facilities. It doesn't strike all inmates, but when it does, it's unmistakable. Symptoms include pacing for hours without stopping, talking in circles, repeating the same sentence endlessly, refusing to eat, or staring at the wall for full days. Some develop rituals, arranging items in specific patterns, tapping rhythms on the wall, or reciting the same phrases during every count. These routines temporarily stabilize the mind, but reinforce the isolation that caused them. For inmates involved in gangs, isolation can be both punishment and strategy. Gang leaders often lose power because they cannot communicate with the outside world. But some adapt by building mental routines that maintain focus. They exercise intensely, memorize legal cases, or write coded notes. These inmates may appear more stable, but the pressure of silence affects them too. No amount of mental discipline eliminates the reality of a room built to erase identity. A small percentage of inmates adapt in unexpected ways. They become quiet, reflective, and resigned to the environment. They detach emotionally from conflict and accept the stillness as permanent. These inmates survive isolation not because the environment is healthy, but because they shut down parts of themselves to endure it. Mental health staff do what they can with limited access. But therapy through a crack in the door, without trust or privacy, rarely transforms the deeper trauma of isolation. Medication may help, but many inmates refuse it because they fear loss of control. The psychological toll of the no-return unit is cumulative. No single day breaks a person. It is the repetition, the unchanging routine, the silence, the absence of social connection that wears down the mind. Over years, the person who entered the unit fades, replaced by someone quieter, angrier, or less connected to reality. This breakdown is not accidental. It's the predictable outcome of a system built around absolute control, where the mind becomes the final battleground. Gang politics, violence, and survival inside. Even though the no-return unit isolates inmates physically, it does not erase prison politics. Gang dynamics remain a major factor in how men navigate life inside these cells. Many inmates are placed in these units precisely because they were high-ranking members of prison gangs, leaders of violent sets, or individuals responsible for orchestrating assaults across the yard. Isolation restricts communication, but influence doesn't disappear. It simply shifts into a quieter, more methodical form. Most inmates entering the no-return unit arrive with tattoos that trace their gang history. Inked symbols, numbers, and phrases on their arms, hands, and torsos serve as identifiers, markers that staff immediately document. These tattoos may reflect affiliations with groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla Family, or other regional gangs that dominate state prison systems. While these markings once served as a source of pride or intimidation, in isolation they take on a different meaning. They become reminders of the violence that led to this point. Despite strict separation, inmates still attempt to communicate across cells. They slide messages under doors using threads of bedsheets, tap coded signals on walls, or shout through vents when officers aren't present. Communication rarely involves casual conversation. Most of it relates to gang business, checking on members in other units, confirming loyalty, or transmitting warnings. Staff constantly battle these attempts, sealing gaps, increasing patrols, and monitoring patterns. But even with the tightest restrictions, information finds ways to move. Violence inside the no-return unit rarely takes the form of physical altercations between inmates because they're almost never in the same space without restraints. Instead, violence becomes covert and targeted. Some inmates refuse meals to protest placement. Others target staff by throwing liquids, attempting to pull an officer's arm through the food slot, or jamming the slot to disrupt operations. More extreme events involve self-harm or suicide attempts triggered by a psychological pressure rather than direct conflict. However, violence doesn't always appear explosive. In many cases, it appears strategic. Gang leaders who once directed operations on the yard now manage what influence they can from isolation. They reflect on old strategies, maintain loyalty through limited communication, and look for opportunities to regain power if ever released back to general population. For some, being in a no-return unit is less a punishment and more a battleground where patience becomes a primary weapon. Officers assigned to these units understand stakes. They receive detailed briefings on inmate histories, stabbings, assaults, escapes, gang roles, and disciplinary patterns. Every escort, every tray delivery, every cell opening requires vigilance. Some inmates wait months for one opportunity. A loose cuff, a distracted officer, or a poorly monitored door can turn routine procedure into a violent encounter. Incidents involving violence towards staff vary in severity. Some inmates throw urine or feces when frustrated or attempting to assert control. Others try to grab an officer through the slot. In rare but severe cases, inmates craft improvised weapons from limited materials. Pieces of metal from ventilation covers, sharpened toothbrush handles, or fragments of plastic. Even inside concrete cells, creativity becomes a tool. Staff regularly inspect cells to search for contraband, though thorough searches require chained escorts, extraction teams, and layers of security. Rivalries between gangs persist despite separation. If two members of hostile groups are housed on the same tier, they attempt to influence housing decisions through threats or behavior meant to provoke staff into moving one of them. Sometimes this leads to targeted aggression towards staff, not as personal attacks, but as strategic efforts to manipulate placement. Officers must interpret these patterns without allowing inmates to dictate control. Survival in the no-return unit depends on discipline more than aggression. Inmates who remain functional often follow strict routines. They exercise daily, clean their cells meticulously, and avoid unnecessary conflict. Some spend hours writing grievances, appeals, or legal motions. Others read extensively and educate themselves as a mental escape. A few turn to religion or meditation. These habits help maintain structure in an environment designed to strip it away. However, not all inmates cope with isolation through discipline. Some become deeply entrenched in gang mindset. They spend hours replaying past conflicts, plotting revenge, or imagining future actions if given the chance. These thoughts provide a sense of purpose, even if that purpose is destructive. The environment encourages inward focus, and for some, that focus becomes a breeding ground for violent ideation. Prison staff attempt to break gang influence by limiting movement, controlling mail, and monitoring patterns. But the reality is that isolation does not eliminate gang identity. It simply freezes it in place. Tattoos fade, but remain visible. Allegiances remain. Reputation spreads even when the inmate cannot move beyond his door. Some inmates become legends within gang networks because they survived years in isolation without breaking. A unique aspect of a no-return unit is that violence often originates from psychological pressure rather than direct conflict. When inmates feel they have nothing left to lose, no family contact, no chance of transfer, no path to parole, they may lash out unpredictably. Officers learn to read subtle cues. A cell unusually clean, an inmate suddenly quiet, or a refusal to accept meals. These behaviors sometimes precede violent outbursts, self-harm, or suicide attempts. Yet in some cases, the environment produces the opposite result. Some gang members, after years inside, distance themselves from old affiliations. They see the cycle of violence and isolation as a dead end. These inmates may write letters disavowing past behavior or formally requesting separation from gang networks. But even then, tattoos remain. They serve as permanent reminders of identities that can't fully be erased. Isolation also affects relationships within gangs. Members expect loyalty even when someone is locked away in a Supermax cell. If they fail to maintain contact or show strength, they risk appearing weak. This pressure fuels some of the mental instability inside these units. Inmates feel they must maintain reputation despite extreme isolation. This expectation leads to calculated displays of aggression, strategic silence, or refusal to comply with staff. The no-return unit forces a merging of environment and identity. Violence doesn't disappear, it adapts. Gang politics survive, they get quieter, more psychological, more symbol-driven. Inmates navigate these dynamics alone, confined to a cell, but still operating under rules shaped long before the steel door closed. Survival depends on understanding these unwritten rules while managing the weight of isolation. For many, the cell becomes a battlefield with no opponent, just pressure, memory, and the struggle to remain intact. Why most never leave alive or sane? The no-return unit is not officially labeled as a permanent holding place, but the reality inside most Supermax systems is clear. Once an inmate enters this level of confinement, the odds of returning to general population are extremely low. Transfers happen, but they are rare, slow, and heavily scrutinized. For many men, the unit becomes the final chapter of their incarceration, mentally, physically, or both. The primary reason inmates rarely leave is risk management. Administrators responsible for housing decisions prioritize institutional safety above all else. Inmates sent to these pods have histories that include stabbing other inmates, planning escapes, attacking officers, or directing gang operations from behind bars. These actions create long-term security flags on their records. Even if they behave well in isolation, the risk associated with their past does not simply disappear. A single incident can mark a person for life within the prison system. Another factor is the psychological wear caused by prolonged isolation. Over months and years, mental stability becomes harder to evaluate. An inmate who appears calm and compliant may be internalizing anger or experiencing silent breakdowns. Mental health staff can assess behavior, but there is no reliable way to predict how someone will react once placed back among other inmates. A person who has lived in near total silence for years might struggle with noise, crowds, or interpersonal conflict. Administrators often decide it's safer to keep them in isolation than risk triggering unpredictable behavior elsewhere. Physical health also declines inside the no-return unit. Limited movement affects muscles, joints, and circulation. Poor diets, lack of sunlight, and minimal exercise contribute to long-term health problems. Heart issues, vitamin deficiencies, weakened immune systems. Medical staff intervene when necessary, but the environment itself accelerates deterioration. Over time, some inmates become too frail or mentally unstable to transition safely to less restrictive housing. The disciplinary structure inside the unit also traps inmates in a cycle. Any act of resistance, no matter how minor, results in extended stays. Throwing a cup of water at the door, refusing a tray, shouting at staff, covering a cell window, or damaging property can reset the clock on their status review. Many inmates, overwhelmed by isolation, engage in behaviors that guarantee continued placement. Staff document each incident, and administrators use these reports as justification to keep the inmate where he is. Suicide attempts and self-harm further complicate release decisions. When someone shows severe psychological distress, security officials hesitate to transfer them to a less supervised environment. This creates a paradox. The very behaviors triggered by isolation can justify longer isolation. Some inmates spiral deeper into instability simply because there is no alternative placement that staff deems safe. Gang affiliation is another anchor. High-ranking gang members often remain in the no-return unit indefinitely because authorities believe they will resume leadership roles the moment they return to general population. Even after renouncing gang ties, inmates with tattooed symbols, spiderweb elbows, coded numbers, block letters, carry visible markers that staff and rival groups recognize. These tattoos expose them to danger in the general population and make reintegration complicated. Even if they want to change, the system views them through the lens of previous allegiances. In rare cases, an inmate demonstrates consistent, long-term stability, no write-ups, no aggression, no signs of mental collapse. These individuals might earn gradual steps down to transitional units, but the process is slow and heavily bureaucratic. A single misstep can undo years of progress. Many inmates simply lack the mental stamina to maintain perfect compliance for that long in an environment designed to break them. Death inside the no-return unit is not always violent. Some inmates die from untreated or progressive health conditions made worse by isolation. Others take their own lives. When a man spends years in silence, staring at concrete and steel, with no human touch, limited purpose, and fading contact with the outside world, desperation becomes common. Officers find inmates unresponsive, sometimes without warning, sometimes after patterns of declining behavior that no one could fully address. Even those who survive and eventually leave rarely return as the same person. Years of sensory deprivation alter the brain. Inmates transferred to slightly less restrictive environments often struggle with simple interactions. Noise overwhelms them. Eye contact feels intrusive. Being around multiple people creates anxiety. Some request to return to isolation because it becomes the only environment they understand. The cell becomes familiar, even comforting, because it's predictable. That psychological imprint is one of the system's most permanent effects. The public often imagines the no-return unit as a place built for discipline. In reality, it's a place built for containment. The men inside are not expected to grow, change, or recover. They are expected to remain where they are until their sentence ends, their health collapses, or their minds fracture. The name no-return unit isn't official, but it fits. It captures the truth that the system rarely admits. Most inmates who enter these cells never fully return. Not to society, not to general population, and not to the version of themselves they were before the door closed. The unit holds people physically, but the real confinement happens in their minds. Once someone spends years alone with nothing but concrete, steel, and a dim light overhead, something shifts. Some men harden. Some fade. Some disappear silently inside their thoughts. Some lose the ability to function in any other environment. By the time the door opens, if it ever does, much of the person who walked in has already been left behind. The no-return unit represents one of the harshest forms of confinement in modern corrections. Built to contain violence, it often produces a different kind of damage, slow, quiet, and irreversible. The men inside these walls carry stories of brutality, mistakes, gang loyalty, and survival. But they also carry the heavy imprint of isolation, a weight that reshapes the mind long after the cell door shuts. In places like ADX Florence and Pelican Bay, these units stand as reminders of a system stretched between safety and punishment, control and consequence. Some argue they're necessary. Others call them destructive. But one reality remains. Once a person enters this environment, the chances of returning to normal life, inside or outside prison, become dangerously small. This is life in the no-return unit, a world built to hold the most violent, yet known for leaving many of its occupants broken long before their sentence ends.